This goes beyond customer experience. What we're talking about here is societal, social benefit. But it starts with looking at the consumer, right? We want to look at buying a home, but in a way that actually works for the consumer. So here's a value chain diagram. I don't know if anybody's heard of Michael Porter value chains. It's a way to look at your business and analyze it, and it's often captured in this graph that has an arrow moving forward. We're moving forward, and you have inbound logistics and operations and outbound logistics and support functions like human resources. It's really a way to take your business and diagnose it, and then he has action plans around each one of these, how they fit together and things like that. And on the end, margins, right? Profit. Right? And this was the basis of pursuing profit in the past, the Michael Porter value chain. He says, take a look at that, but see where that touches social needs and important things to people, to consumers. But you'll notice from this diagram, there's something conspicuously missing, and that's like people, like human beings, anything related to experience or the consumer. It's missing from this diagram, right? So maybe we need diagrams like this. Let's think about buying a home, but in a way that actually works for the consumer. And this is a diagram that our friend Sophia Hussein presented at this conference in 2014 in Boulder. You can find it online in an article. But she describes an ecosystem that she mapped out based on user research. She was looking at how do people buy a home from their perspective, looking at the world from the outside in rather from the inside out. The value chain diagram is really an inside-out view of the world. This is an outside-in view of the world. And she explained how people select a neighborhood, and then there in yellow, they determine what they can afford. They find a home, they buy a new home, they move, and they sell a home. And there's sub-behaviors and thoughts and emotions and touch points. So if we're going to think about shared value, we can do the value chain diagram and understand how our business works. But necessarily, to create shared value, we have to look at things in a way that works for the consumer. And that's what these pictures do. So, we talk about mapping experiences and design strategy and things like that, and that's all good. But I think one of the things at a higher level, one of the things that we contribute to the broader strategic picture is this notion of how does the world really work for our consumers? And if that's going to be the basis of our competitive advantage, if shared value is a new competitive advantage, at the core of that is understanding human experience. At the core of the new corporate strategy advantage is understanding human experience. And one of the principles that they use in shared value to activate shared value and actually make profit from it is to reimagine value, right? That's what they talk about, reimagining value. But it's reimagining value from the outside in, from the consumer's perspective, right? This is our perspective. I hope when I say this, everybody says, yeah, this is what I'm striving to do as well, too. This goes beyond customer journey. So we were talking about, and I have my opinion on CX versus UX versus BX and all of those things. But I think what we're talking here is beyond customer journey. Here's an example of a map created by Jim Tincher. And it's a typical map where you become aware of the solution. This says awareness up here, and then you research, and then you purchase, right? And then there's post-sale, right? And that's really looking at the individual, the human being, in relationship to my company. It's looking at a certain point of view that they're a customer of mine, and I don't care about the rest of their world. I'm only thinking about how they're related to me. That's important, and we need to optimize that, and that's a great source of strategic prioritization. But I think when we're talking about experience, and I think this is another point that Paul made today, when we're talking about experience, we're really talking about human experience and the human capital. Right? So the map that Sophia Hussein drew wasn't about how does somebody become aware of us, how does somebody buy us, how do they stay loyal to us? You can see that it's customer-centric, but it's almost in a selfish way, as if to say there's not the rest of this world out there that humans act in. Again, shared value is looking at that and how people interact with one another in society and using that as a source of strategic advantage. So my conclusion is that business is not only a math problem. If everybody gets that memo, then we need to create real human and social value from the outside in and not from the inside out. And I think that's what we bring to the strategic conversation. And it may be in a grassroots way. So I've never been at the proverbial strategy table, very rarely. If I have been, it was a chair. I had a seat at the table, but it was a chair that I brought myself, and it was a fold-up lawn chair. So that's about it. So I'm not necessarily saying we need to go into the CEO's office and pound our fist on there, but I think in a grassroots way, the work that we do has a potentially broader impact on our organizations to think about themselves from the outside in, changing mindsets. So I want to shift gears just a little bit, and I'll come back to the idea of shared value at the end as well, too. And I want to ask the question, what is a market? Because this is a fundamental definition that an organization has that guides a lot of its decision-making. What is a market? And here's a typical market definition map, right? You have some piece of the pie, 100% of some market, that's segmented, and then we represent one of those boxes, right? And what management does, and what management has learned to do, and what managers do, is optimize inside that box. But it's literally a box that they self-defined and then work within. And it's artificial. This isn't how the market sees itself. This is an artificial overlay on top of the market that our companies then manage to and act around. And it leads to what I call strategy myopia. Now, I mentioned the article Marketing Myopia, so I took the term right from Theodore Levitt, and I'm going to come back to Levitt in a minute, too. But strategy myopia, similar concept, and it's basically the inability of an organization to make broader strategic decisions because they have blinders on. They have this market definition of what they think their market is and how they're supposed to behave based on that definition. So strategy myopia is a short-sightedness in strategic thinking. But how might we think about the market differently? We can think about the market from the consumer's point of view. And that's what Scott Cook, the founder of Intuit, was referring to when he made this quote, which I found in a book called The Myths of Innovation by Scott Birkin. The greatest competitor in tax software, Intuit makes tax software, was not the industry, it was the pencil. The pencil is a tough and resilient substitute, yet the entire industry had overlooked it. So he's saying, you could take TurboTax and do that market definition. There's TurboTax, some other tax software, and they have the biggest percentage of it. That's their slice of the pie. Let's optimize that. But what he's saying is, let's look at the market from the customer's standpoint. When you're doing your taxes, you might have to make a sub-calculation, right? That's your goal in that moment, is to make a sub-calculation. And in that moment, Intuit is competing with a pencil because you can just grab a pencil and do that, right? So he knew his software had to be easier to use, better to use than a pencil, right? So Intuit competes with pencils. That's what he's basically saying here. He's saying, look at your market in a completely different way. And this brings up the notion of jobs to be done. Now, in 2014 in Boulder, I gave a talk, not too long after Sophia Hussein's talk, on jobs to be done. Jobs to be done is, if you don't know that term, I recommend that you go ahead and look at that online. It's a perspective, it's a lens, it's a framework that Clayton Christensen made popular in his book, The Innovator's Solution, where he's talking about a focus on the goal or the need. A job to be done is not a task, it's actually a goal or a need. To look at the market from the customer standpoint and what they're trying to get done. So he sees customers as kind of goal-driven actors in the world. And you can question the theory, but the idea of I need to get a job done and a pencil will do that quicker than tax software. We can say then in that moment that the pencil competes with the tax software through the lens of jobs to be done. And I also talked about a case study that we had done, a project that we had done at Citrix, where we had done a lot of user research looking at what are the jobs to be done. This was working in the space of GoToMeeting. Citrix makes GoToMeeting. What are all the jobs that people are trying to get done that we could observe? And we created a map of those jobs and then brought that into a workshop, and we're discussing that with our partners and stakeholders inside the organization. But notice it doesn't say, what's the customer journey with GoToMeeting? How do they find out about GoToMeeting? How do they install it? It says up there in the upper left, how people work, right? We were looking beyond just the journey of somebody had with GoToMeeting. We wanted to know all the other rest of the parts of the ecosystem of how that fits into their daily lives when they engage in meetings in particular. And we were using the lens of jobs to be done to go out and kind of filter and find those insights to talk about jobs to be done. So this brings up the question, and this is a question that Theodore Levitt brings up in his article, Marketing Myopia. What market are you really in? And he points to the rail industry in the United States in about the beginning of the 20th century. In the 19th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, rail, everybody would have invested in rail. It was the growing business. It was a booming industry, but then it started to decline. And he blames the decline not on the fact that they couldn't build faster locomotives and bigger locomotives or have more track, but they failed to realize that their market grew from the customer perspective broader than how they defined themselves. They saw themselves in the locomotive and business of maintaining tracks, but the consumers saw them in the business of transportation, getting them from point A to point B. And as alternative sources of transportation became popular, like the automobile, people chose that over train travel. Just like people might choose a pencil over tax software to get a job done. So this photo is a little bit ironic, because I believe the message here was from the rail companies, look how big we are. We got this big locomotive. We're much bigger than a car, right? That's how they saw themselves. But a consumer looking at this would say, actually, I'd rather take the car. So this actually makes that comparison that was going on in the mind at the time. So when he asked the question, what market are you really in, the rail industry should have said, we're in the transportation business, or perhaps even beyond. Let me ask that question here for Kodak. What market is Kodak really in, right? And they saw themselves in the film business, in film industry, right? They defined film industry. Here's our box. We're in the film industry. Although Kodak has some of the original and most important patents in digital photography, strategy myopia kept them from making decisions outside of that box that they defined for themselves.